If you've ever seen or participated in communion, some people call it the Lord's Supper, you probably picture a couple of familiar items. A small piece of bread that represents Jesus' body broken for us, and juice or wine that reminds us of his blood poured out for us. But that meal, it didn't originate in a church. In fact, we trace the tradition of communion back to one particular meal, one that Jesus shared with his disciples just before he was arrested and ultimately crucified. A meal we now call the Last Supper. And the actual Last Supper, the one Jesus ate with his disciples, looked very different from what we experience today in communion. There was no church building, no silver trays being passed around. It was a group of men reclining around a low table, sharing a meal, specifically a Passover meal. Passover was, and still is, an annual celebration, and the meal itself revolved around a story that had been told for nearly 1,500 years before Jesus walked the earth. And perhaps you remember the story. God's people, the Israelites, had been living in Egypt for several centuries. But over time, they were forced into slavery under Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Eventually, God raised up a man named Moses to confront Pharaoh and demand that he let the Israelites go. But Pharaoh refused. And what followed was a series of dramatic events, plagues that swept across Egypt as God displayed his power and pressured Pharaoh to release the Jews. And that story reached its turning point on one particular night. After more than 400 years of slavery, God was about to deliver them. On that night, he instructed every Hebrew family to take a lamb without defect and sacrifice it. They were told then to spread its blood over the door frames of their homes. They were to go inside and wait because judgment was coming. And that night, the firstborn throughout Egypt would die. But where the blood of the lamb marked the doorway, death would pass over, hence the name, Passover. That was when slavery ended for the Jews and freedom began. And God commanded them to remember that defining event every year, generation after generation. He didn't want the memory of that rescue to ever fade away. In the book of Exodus, he instructed his people, when you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. The traditional meal to celebrate Passover actually has a name. It's called the seder. Jewish families still celebrate it today. You may have even been invited to one or even participated in one yourself. And it's really remarkable. The essence of the Seder meal has been preserved for thousands of years. And that's very intentional because the Seder is a carefully ordered retelling of that rescue story. In fact, the word Seder means order because the meal follows a set sequence. Each element points back to the story of God delivering the Israelites from bondage. Step by step, the meal is designed so that every generation remembers what God did to bring his people out of slavery and into freedom. We have to remember, this tradition began at a time very different from today, where it's easy for us to capture moments and have things documented. The tradition of the Seder meal was the main way to tell each passing generation about God's past faithfulness. So every year, in detail, this meal reminds generations of Jews of what happened at the time of Moses, when God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. So when Jesus gathered with his disciples for Passover, they were remembering a rescue story that had shaped their people for centuries. What they didn't know was that a new rescue story was about to be written. The gospel writer Luke tells us that before this particular Passover meal, Jesus said something peculiar. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Jesus was drawing attention to something familiar, the Passover meal, while letting them know that this time it would be different. To understand what Jesus was doing that night and to better understand the significance of it, we need to get a picture of what actually would have been on the table. Remember, the elements of the Passover meal were carefully chosen because each one helped tell the story. At the center of the Passover meal was the lamb, representing the lamb whose blood had been spread on the doorposts the night God delivered the Israelites from Egypt. The lamb reminded God's people that their rescue required a substitute. Something innocent died so people could live. The lamb wasn't just part of the meal, it was central to everything. It was the reason Passover existed. Then there was the unleavened bread made without yeast. In the Passover meal, it was known as the bread of affliction. It was simple bread, the kind people ate when they had very little. For the Israelites, it reminded them of the conditions they endured as slaves in Egypt, the poverty, the oppression, and suffering they experienced under Pharaoh. But the bread also told another part of the story. When God delivered them, they had to leave Egypt so quickly that there was no time to wait for the dough to rise. They left in a hurry, trusting God to lead them into freedom. So the bread was made without yeast. It was simple, it was pure and uncorrupted. As another reminder of the conditions the Jews faced as slaves, the meal would have included bitter herbs. Think about this for a second. Have you ever taken a bite of horseradish or something else so strong it makes your eyes water, it makes your face tense up? That sharp, bitter taste during the meal was intentional. It was a sensory reminder of the harshness of slavery. It ensured that future generations remembered what the people before them endured. And throughout the meal, 4 cups of wine were shared at different points. Each cup marked a promise God had made to rescue his people, and a special prayer was spoken after each one. The first cup was the cup of sanctification, a reminder that God was setting them apart and bringing them out of slavery. The second cup was the cup of deliverance, remembering how God brought them out from under the slavery of Egypt. The third was the cup of redemption, celebrating how God defeated their enemies and secured their freedom. And fourth was the cup of praise, when the meal ended with songs of gratitude and worship for what God had done. None of this was new to the disciples. They had eaten this meal every year. They had heard every prayer so many times they could recite them from memory. They knew the story. They knew what everything meant. What they didn't expect was that Jesus was about to place himself at the center of it all. Early in the meal, Jesus had already surprised the disciples by kneeling down and washing their feet, taking the role of a servant. And after that, he did something even more surprising. Jesus took the bread, the pure, uncorrupted bread that had always symbolized affliction and suffering, and he said, "This is my body given for you." Then he took a cup of wine after supper, one of the 4 cups shared during the Passover meal, one that was a reminder of redemption and freedom, and said, "This cup is my blood, a new covenant poured out for you." Now at the time, they must have been thinking, this isn't the Passover we remember. Like, what exactly is he talking about? And to complicate it even more, after that Passover meal, Jesus was arrested, beaten, mocked, accused of rebellion against Rome, and then sentenced to death. He was forced to carry his own cross to a hill outside the city where he was ultimately crucified. So whatever Jesus was talking about that night at Passover didn't seem to matter anymore. He was gone. This movement Jesus started was over. But 3 days later, the disciples began to get a glimpse of the bigger picture Jesus was alluding to during that last Passover meal together. The Sunday morning after Jesus died, they found an empty tomb. And then they saw with their own eyes, along with hundreds of other people, a walking, talking Jesus. He had been raised to life. For almost 1,500 years, Passover had always been about God's people being rescued from slavery. But now, a new rescue was being revealed. Jesus was showing them that Passover had been pointing to something else. Not just freedom from an oppressing nation, but freedom from sin, from guilt, freedom from fear. And with his resurrection, Jesus showed that there was even freedom from death. Perhaps the disciples remembered those final few words Jesus spoke to them during that Passover meal. This is my body given for you. This is my cup that has been poured out for you. This is a new covenant. And at that Last Supper, that Passover meal, Jesus was pointing them, and now you and me, towards something more, toward a restored relationship with God, a new kind of freedom. Jesus didn't say, remember what happened in Egypt? He said, remember me. From the very beginning, God had been preparing the world for what Jesus was about to do. And from that night forward, the night of that Last Supper, freedom wouldn't just be remembered through a lamb on the table. Permanent and lasting freedom would come through the perfect, spotless Lamb who died on a cross to cover the sins of the world, mine and yours. Deliverance wouldn't be marked by blood on a doorway. It would be marked by Jesus' blood in an empty tomb. It's the moment God made it unmistakably clear that suffering isn't the end. Death does not get the final word. We've been rescued. And at Easter, we remember that Jesus changed everything. And the invitation is the same today as it's always been, to trust him, to follow him, and to believe that the freedom he secured through his death and his resurrection is available to every one of us. So the next time you participate in communion, remember what that moment points back to. The bread reminds us that his body was broken. The cup reminds us that his blood was poured out. He is the perfect lamb who was sacrificed. And just as Passover reminded generation after generation that God had rescued his people from slavery, the death and resurrection of Jesus shows us the greater rescue that God had been preparing all along.